when you give a mouse a cookie, they get away with something, they keep building it up, and they keep doing worse and worse stuff, more disruptive and more disruptive. So yesterday we were talking about elsewhere. I think on the East Coast, this started before it started yesterday on the West Coast and the rest of the country. So we were talking about Chicago O'Hare. There were anti-Israel demonstrators who were blocking the airport there. And then by the time we were off the air yesterday, it was happening all across the country. And this was coordinated, and law enforcement should have known full well about it, because I saw after the fact some flyers that were going around that said, we're going to have this national movement. There's all these cities that have agreed to participate and to block airports. And so that included Sea-Tac Airport. Como News reported on this at the time. I mean, there were people walking with their bags. They blocked the one of the roads into Sea-Tac Airport. And so what happened is, once it went on for long enough, because we already know in this state law enforcement can't do what Florida did when this happened yesterday and just pick up the people, haul them off, and throw them to the side of the road, which was also a little bit hilarious. But here it takes forever, apparently, to clear protesters from block. We saw it in Seattle, it took 5 hours when they were blocking I-5. So according to Como News, 46 pro-Palestinian protesters arrested for blocking the road to Sea-Tac Airport. But because they always, they'll find these weird creative ways to link themselves in concrete and their hands in these tubes. And so they anticipate, although I don't know why they anticipate in Washington state that police will move them, because we've seen that police just are told by politicians to look the other way or to just ask them really, really nicely to leave. And in this case, though, I don't know if they were anticipating that police would try more aggressively after the backlash over I-5 to move them off the interstate. But, they had all we're not going to let go and we're not going to move. And so you've got police coming in and trying to get them off the interstate. It took a while, though. There was a little citizen alert for people in the area. It's pilots walking, had to get out and walk away. And then eventually police were able to move the protesters over to the curb and handcuff them. 46 is a pretty good haul. I will say 46 is a pretty good haul for a Seattle area protest. They did it also more quickly than what happened on I-5. And again, I think that the political pressure and the embarrassment of, the criticism of the State Patrol, the criticism of Seattle officials and state officials after the blockade on Interstate 5, I do believe had a little bit of an impact on their willingness to go a little more hands-on with these demonstrators to get them off the freeway. But here, I'm going to read you something that'll make you so mad. So mad. You know who said something yesterday about the protesters and the blockade? Would you look at this? Bob Ferguson, Attorney General Bob Ferguson, on his campaign Twitter, of course. Attorney General Bob Ferguson called it unacceptable. He said, our roads and transportation facilities must be open for Washingtonians and emergency vehicles. I appreciate the response by law enforcement working to clear this important access to the airport. Well, isn't that something? Bob Ferguson, who had nothing to say when protesters, these same exact protesters, blocked I-5 for 5 to 6 hours, nothing to say at the time. It's also interesting because when he says, I appreciate the response from law enforcement working to clear this important access to the airport, roadways must remain open for emergency vehicles. There were ambulances stuck in the I-5 blockade back in January. Bob Ferguson didn't say anything about that. And when he was cornered by Como News at an event to ask about the State Patrol response, he said, well, I'm not going to give my opinion. They're our client and this isn't my place to comment on that. Well, apparently it's his place now. It's his place now that he's in a hotly contested race for the governor's office, and he's getting very, very concerned about his track record on public safety issues and his track record of absolutely never speaking out about the far left insanity and rioters and protesters. I mean, did Bob Ferguson say anything when there were anti-Semitic demonstrations on the campus of his alma mater at UW? Nope. Did he say anything when rioters looted downtown businesses to the studs in the summer of 2020 and lit cop cars on fire? Nope. Did he say anything when rioters took over 6 square blocks of the city of Seattle as the state's chief law enforcer? Nope. What's different now? Oh, that's right. He's running for governor and he's starting to realize that there is actually a chance that he could lose. And so now he's trying to appeal to the vast majority of Washingtonians who think things like this are certifiably insane. And I said earlier, I hate to say I told you so, but back when the blockade happened in January, I think it happened on the 6th. And so it was on the 3-year anniversary of the siege on our nation's capital. And at the time, Bob Ferguson had plenty of time to speak out about January 6th, 3 years later on the anniversary, but no time in the world to condemn in real time what was happening on the interstate in Seattle. And I said at the time that this isn't a surprise. This is a slow, gradual outcome for letting these protesters get away with all sorts of stuff over the years. And I even said at the time, what's next? What are they going to do after they blockade the interstate? Here are some clips. You let them shut down a Christmas tree lighting. They're emboldened. You let them shut down a bridge. They're emboldened. You let them take over 6 square blocks of a city. They're emboldened. Why would they not believe that they can take over an interstate? And what are they going to do next? What's bigger than that? They have completely been emboldened. Governor Jay Inslee, Attorney General Bob Ferguson, you know what they were focused on that day? Well, it was January 6th. They were focused on condemning an act of domestic terrorism that happened 3 years ago. And they were also focused on the UW Huskies and their championship football game and putting out tweets about that. Do you think that they said anything about this over the weekend? No. Silence. So again, no consequences, no condemnation. And we wonder, well, why do they think they can do this? Because they can do this. They have done this. Politicians have allowed this environment. Politicians have emboldened activists to believe that they can do this and get away with it. Politicians like Bob Ferguson, who now, because he wants to be the governor, is trying to rewrite history and act as if he's not okay with things that he's been completely silent and complicit on for years. We saw this just a couple weeks ago when he came out with King 5 and he announced his public safety plan and said he never supported the rollbacks on police pursuits. And we reached out to his office and said, what do you mean? He never said anything about that publicly for the past 3 years. Now, all of a sudden, now that it's been repealed with an initiative, he's saying, oh, I never supported it anyway. Well, how convenient. So we tried to press him to provide proof that he told anyone at all, that he wasn't in support of what his fellow Democrats did on police pursuits. And what did? They sent Nicole an email saying they'd never respond to a request of ours ever again. So no, Bob Ferguson, you don't get away with, for 15 years, saying nothing about the acts of criminal civil unrest. And then all of a sudden, when you're running for governor and you have a very strong public safety opponent, you get to say, well, this is unacceptable. Yeah, it is unacceptable. What's even more unacceptable is it took you this long to say something. I'll also say that there was an effort in Olympia this past legislative session to make stuff like this a felony. Now, it would have applied specifically to people who are organizing organizing demonstrations that block transportation or infrastructure for transportation. So roads, bridges, etc. Representative Peter Obarno said, and this was a Republican bill, House Bill 2358. However, it did have just a couple Democratic supporters. But even with that, as Obarno points out, House Democrats refused to hear the bill. It would have made it a Class C felony with a $5,000 fine to be an organizer of people obstructing highways. So even with a bill that, and this was put out right after the I-5 ordeal, and so you had a couple Democrats who were willing to sign on, but not enough for the House Democrats to prioritize it. So if this is truly unacceptable, as Bob Ferguson now says, who's trying to be the standard bearer of the Democratic Party, does he also think it's unacceptable that Democrats wouldn't strengthen laws around this? Would he support? Nicole, let's reach out to Bob Ferguson's office and his campaign. Even though they told us they're not responding to us anymore, we're still going to reach out. Ask him if he supports that bill. Would he support bringing that bill back up for consideration? Because if he finds it unacceptable, I don't see why in the world he would not.